My mother always said if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all.
Good words to live by. Unfortunately, we're all guilty of running our mouths and hurting other people. Without even stopping to think, we open our mouths and out come our opinions on someone else's lifestyle, the way they dress, or how they irritate us. It's not like we aren't all aware of how it feels to be the subject of someone else's harmful words. If we know how much it hurts to have such words directed at us, why do we allow foul talk in our own lives? Well, a good first step in understanding the power of our words is listening to someone we can trust on the subject. Now, there are people that we listen to and we think, yeah, whatever. And there are people who, when they speak, command our attention. We know that they're truthful. We know that they speak from experience. And we can trust what they say. And we allow them to have influence over our choices. Sometimes that person's a parent. Sometimes that person's a teacher. Or sometimes that person's a friend. But in this case, I'm talking about the ultimate example of who we can trust. Of course, I'm talking about Jesus. For me, I've often told people when they say something counter to what Jesus said, I say this, well, Jesus said such and such, and then I say, I'll go with what Jesus said. And that's the end of the discussion as far as I'm concerned. Jesus taught numerous things, and we'll look at one of his teachings in this video. Now, Jesus, who will judge us on the last day, said this. He said, I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. That's in Matthew 12, verses 36 and 37. Jesus made it perfectly clear. The power of life and death is in our tongues. It's such a small part of our body, but it controls our destiny. James also in his letter said in chapter 3, verses 2 through 5, for we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he's a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. We don't use the word bridle much. To bridle means to control or restrain. But we do hear of a horse's bridle. A bridle that is put on a horse is a harness that goes on the horse's head to control the horse. A bridle includes the reins and something called a bit. The bit is a metal mouthpiece put into the horse's mouth and held in place by the harness. The rider can then control the horse's movement by tugging left or right on the reins, which in turn moves the bit left or right. Whichever way the bit moves, the horse's head follows, and then so does the rest of its body. James then continues, verse 3. He said, if we put bits into the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we guide their whole bodies as well. Then in verse 4, he says, look at the ships also. Though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they're guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. Now let me tell you, if you've ever seen an aircraft carrier up close, you know that it is massive. Standing on a pier between two aircraft carriers gives you the same sensation as when you're downtown in a large city, between several tall buildings. The only way to look at the sky is to look straight up. The rest of your field of vision is taken up by steel. However, the rudder on these extraordinary ships is quite small in comparison to the entire ship. And you can see how such a small thing can control so much. I think it's a great way to illustrate the power of the tongue, which is so small in comparison to the rest of the body. So then James continues in verse 5. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. And we'll drop down to verse 10, where James says, from the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. He's talking about how we become hypocrites by the way we use our tongues. We praise God in prayer and song on Sunday. Then we tell a dirty joke on Monday. We speak politely to our parents. And then we have garbage mouths around our friends. In fact, Sally once heard a lady ask a teenage boy who had just said some pretty filthy things. She said, "Do you kiss your mama with that mouth?" Remember, Jesus said, "By your words." Look, you can attend every Bible class. You can attend every worship service, fellowship. You can sing with feeling. You can participate in the Lord's Supper. You can give generously. You can even lead public prayer. You can do all these things and still be lost. You can be lost because of the way you use your tongue. You think, does God really care what I say every minute of the day? Well, Hebrews 4:13 tells us that no creature is hidden from his sight, but we are all naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. That means he sees everything. Psalm 139:4 also says, "Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether." God knows what we're going to say before we even say it. And what do you think the average number of words a person speaks in a week? Research shows that an average person speaks at least 7,000 words per day. And many people speak way more than that. That's over 2.5 million words per year. And you know what? God hears every single one of them. I am accountable to God for every one of those 2.5 million words a year I've spoken. And those words, Jesus says, will either justify me or condemn me. Let's look at how we can use our tongues to condemn ourselves. Let's look at sins of the tongue. First up, profanity. The Bible uses several terms to describe what we're talking about, such as corrupt speech, filthiness, foolish talking, filthy communication. For example, Ephesians 4:29 and 31 say, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." And in verse 31 he says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice." He says, let no corrupt talk come out of your mouths. So what is corrupting talk? If you look at that word corrupt, the original Greek word means rotten. Rotten. The NASB calls it unwholesome talk. It's talk that ruins something pure. Instead, Paul says, use your tongue for good. And then Ephesians chapter 5 opens with Paul expressing how we are to be imitators of Christ. Then in Ephesians 5:3 and 4, he tells these Christians in Ephesus which behaviors are not acceptable. And he says this, "But sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving." He talks about filthiness, foolish talking, crude joking, all sins of the tongue. Some people think that just a little foul language is okay. Just one or two crude jokes here or there isn't too bad. People, God calls us to be pure. That means no impurities, like foul language and crude jokes. Colossians 3:8 in the beginning of verse 9 says, "But now you must put them all away." So what do we got to put away? Anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another. So we've got to put slander and obscene talk out of our mouths. And this includes four-letter words. It also includes suggestive words. Now, some people would never say a four-letter word, but they'll use suggestive speech to say the very same thing. And Paul also mentions slander, which is lying about someone else. And this is also called malicious gossip, which is closely related. And we're going to look at gossip in a few minutes. Another way of speaking profanity is to use God's name in vain. One way of doing that is using God's name with undue reverence or respect. Exodus chapter 20 verse 7 lists this as the third commandment in the law of Moses. This commandment is repeated several times in the first 5 books of the Bible. Again, the Bible is very clear about how God views the misuse of your tongue. Now, the second sin of the tongue after profanity is lying. We studied lying in last week's lesson. If you saw it, you'll recall that it's listed twice in the 7 sins that are an abomination to God. Proverbs 6, 17 and 19. Now that says this in Proverbs. There are 6 things that the Lord hates. 7 are an abomination to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil, a false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers. And note also, he who sows discord among brothers is also done with the tongue. Sowing discord is often done by being two-faced. Two-faced people use their tongue as a weapon, and they use it as a shield. They'll use it when they badmouth you, and then they'll use it to appear friendly to your face. Two-faced people are liars. They hide their hatred for you with lies. So don't be two-faced, don't be a liar, don't sow discord. So what we see is 3 of the 7 things that are an abomination to God involve the tongue. Still think what you say isn't that important? Now the third sin of the tongue we'll look at is gossip. I mentioned that slandering and gossip are closely related. Proverbs 11:13 says, "Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy in spirit keeps a thing covered." There are many people who love to be in the know and love to hear the juicy gossip about another person. And many just have to tell someone else or else they're going to bust, especially if the gossip's something negative about another person. Now often this is simply another way of sowing discord, and often spreading gossip involves being two-faced. People's reputations have been ruined by what others whisper about them. Proverbs 17:9 talks about gossipers, and it says, "Whoever covers an offense seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates close friends." Have you ever seen friends go separate ways because of things that others have said about one of them? Now, sadly, oftentimes the gossip that's whispered isn't even true. But truth really isn't important to a gossiper, now is it? Solomon gives some really good advice in Proverbs 20 and 19. He writes, "Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate with a simple babbler." Now, the original Hebrew for this word babbler actually means one who is simple in his lips. So what do we do about gossiping? Proverbs 26:20 says, "For lack of wood the fire goes out, and where there's no whisper, quarreling ceases." Solomon's saying, don't add fuel to the fire. Just don't repeat what you've heard, and it'll die out. But unfortunately, as Solomon writes in verse 21, "As charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire, so is a quarrelsome man for kindling strife." Some people just love to keep the fire going. They just love to keep things stirred up. They love to, as we say, stir the pot. They can't stand for things to be still and calm. They just love to add fuel to the flames and stir the pot whenever they can. So we know gossip is hurtful and destructive. It's that way whether you repeat it or you don't repeat it. The Bible warns of another person to beware of. Have you ever known a flatterer? I'm not talking about someone who simply says nice things. I'm talking about someone who speaks highly of you when you're there. But once your back's turned, they're not so nice. Be very leery of such people. While describing some of the most evil people in the world, Paul in Romans 1:29 and 30 calls out exactly who we've been looking at today. Look at how he describes these evil people. He says, "They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, and the list goes on and on. Now let me give you 4 simple rules for living, and this lesson will be yours. Number 1, you have the right and sometimes the obligation to be silent. The wisest man that ever lived said in Ecclesiastes 3:7 that there's a time to keep silence and a time to speak. We don't have to talk every time we have the opportunity. You may have heard the famous quote by Abraham Lincoln. He said, "It's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and to remove all doubt." Maybe he was misquoting Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 28. It says, "Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he's deemed intelligent." Good advice. Number 2, think before you speak. James 1:19 tells us to be quick to hear and slow to speak. I want you to notice, your ears are not designed to be shut, but your mouth is. Proverbs 15:28 tells us, "The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer." In other words, righteous people will think about how to answer. But the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. Pours out evil things. It just flows out. Proverbs 18:13 says, "If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame." Listen before you decide something. Look, wise men designed our court system in such a way as to make sure that each side is heard in its entirety before a judgment is rendered. And that's exactly what God tells us to do in our own lives. And then number 3, when you do speak, speak sparingly. Proverbs 10:19 gives some wise advice. When words are many, transgression is not lacking, but whoever restrains his lips is prudent. And so does Proverbs 13:3. It says, "Whoever guards his mouth preserves his life. He who opens wide his lips comes to ruin." And lastly, advice number 4, guard your heart. Look carefully at these verses. Look at the bottom half of the slide, and you'll see the verse we started with. We saw that Jesus said on the judgment, we would give account for every careless thing we say. But notice what he said leading up to that statement. Look at the top of the slide at verse 34. Before he tells these people that they'll be judged for every careless thing they say, he says, "How can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. The good person out of his good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil." That's Matthew 12:34-37. So, knowing that the heart is the key to what comes out of your mouth, you should do as David did, as we read in Psalm 17:3. David prayed to God here. He says, "I have purposed that my mouth will not transgress." Now, wouldn't this be a much better world if more people determined to not sin with their mouth? Use your words in a good way and avoid using your mouth in a sinful way. And remember, we always have a choice. We always have a choice of what we're going to say. And we'll look next week at how we should be using our tongues. But until then, study your Bibles, pray to God for help in controlling your tongues, and say something nice to someone who needs it. And, as Sally says, be sweet.